Greetings in Jesus' wonderful name and welcome to Riverside Chats. I began a series on love and I'm looking at an exposition of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're looking today at the supremacy of love, how love is the greatest than anything in the world. We are looking at verses 8 to verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 13. Paul declares love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Love is permanent. Love is the greatest. There is no virtue greater than the virtue of love. God is love. All pure love stems from God. There are perversions of what we call love, but that has been good love that has been perverted, and that does not come from God. James declares every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variableness, no shadow of turning. Paul here contrasts the permanence of love with the temporary nature of the spiritual gifts. Oh, there were some who became pompous because of the spiritual gifts they had. Some were proud of the gift of tongues, that they could speak in languages only known by God. Now, some people say tongues is of the devil. I don't know what Bible you read, but tongues is a legitimate gift. Oh, there is the abuse of tongues, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Tongues has its rightful place in the public assembly. It must be accompanied by interpretation. Paul evaluates and Paul publicly talks about the importance of prophecies as compared to tongues. Paul said, I'd rather prophesy and be understood by all in the assembly than speak in tongues with no one understanding. Paul said, oh, the gift of tongues must be accompanied by interpretation. So the unbeliever could say, wow, that church service is really impressive, because one speaks in a tongue, not knowing what he is speaking, but another gives perfect interpretation to everything that has been said. You see, one has to be honest. I know there are some people who just open their mouth and they speak. They don't know whether they have interpretation to that tongue. But God leads people in particular ways. Now, it doesn't mean if you don't speak in tongues, it's wrong. You are not the litmus test for good theology. God's word is. You know, sometimes for a long time I couldn't understand tongues because I didn't speak in tongues. There was a time I came to understand it. Now there's some people who really abuse it. Now, I mean, you can speak in tongues with no interpretation, but that is to be in your own quiet time before God, because that is what edifies you, the believer. Paul says prophecy and tongues and knowledge are partial, and they will come to an end sometimes when Jesus comes again. Now, there are some people who are proponents of a doctrine called the cessation of the gifts. And they say, well, you know, these things don't happen anymore because Jesus said they've come to an end. Oh, it doesn't tell you when it'll come to an end. It tells you, and by implication, it is believed that it'll come to an end when the kingdom is fully realized. You know, some people try to fit their own theology into exegesis, and that's eisegesis. There is no verse in the Bible that says the miraculous and healing and all of these things have come to an end with the apostles. Jesus actually gave more scope for the miraculous. He said, because I go to the Father, greater things you will be able to do than I ever did. Jesus said, as he is in the world, so are we. You know, one of the reasons we don't see the miraculous in the church is because we have so much unbelief. A Baptist was once talking to a Assembly of God. You know, the Baptists and the Assemblies of God are very similar. They are great mission organizations. They have great outreach. But one speaks in tongues and the other does not. But someone was comparing them and said, well, you know, Baptists and Assembly of God are pretty much the same. You know, one speaks in tongues and the other don't. But they both have unbelief. The analogy of childhood versus adulthood here illustrates spiritual maturity. Paul says our current understanding of God is limited, but in eternity we will know him fully. Paul impresses on our hearts that love is the greatest of all. In verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, now faith, hope, and love abide. These three. But the greatest of these is love. Oh, faith is wonderful. Wow. Faith can move mountains. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. God highlights the importance of faith. Actually, God responds to nothing but faith. Faith here is so wonderfully presented. And then there's hope. Solomon of old declares, if you don't have hope, the heart becomes sick. A wounded spirit dries up the bones. Faith and hope are important. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. But Paul emphatically declares, love is the greatest. Why? Because love is eternal. Faith and hope will be fulfilled in heaven, but love will continue forever. There is here the eternality of love. God is love. We love God because he first loved us. We must love the Lord our God with all of our heart, with all of our mind, with all of our strength. That love will continue forever. You see, love is eternal. Paul here also presents that love is foundational. It's foundational to hope and faith. You cannot have faith and hope without love. You know why? Because faith works by love. You might have a brand new Ferrari, but if you don't have gasoline in the Ferrari, it won't work, because the Ferrari works by gasoline. Like an automobile works by gasoline, faith works by love. And without love, there's no hope. I'm hoping for better things. I won't swim in the waters of melancholy. I'll have hope. Christ in us, the hope of glory. I have a hope that will surely endure after the passing of time. I have a future in heaven for sure, there in those mansions sublime. True faith and hope are expressed through love. Why is love the greatest? Because love is eternal. Why is love the greatest? Because love is foundational to hope and faith. Why is love the greatest? Because God himself is love. 1 John 8:4. If we say we love God and hate our brother, then God's love is not perfected in us. Love is the highest Christian virtue. As we look at 1 Corinthians 13, it challenges us to put love above all of our achievements and spiritual gifts and knowledge. It motivates us to be selfless, to walk in humility, and endure in all things. True Christianity and true spirituality is not about our abilities and knowledge. God is more interested in your character than your resume. True spirituality is not about abilities or knowledge, but about embodying God's love in everyday life. How about you? Are you walking in love? 1 Corinthians 13, by the great apostle himself, is a wonderful guide to how we should love. God bless you and love ya.